The Forbidden Game. John never thought much about the supernatural. Ghost stories were for campfires, not dorm rooms. But that night, as he sifted through Andrew's abandoned belongings months after the incident, he found a small sticky note taped to the bottom of a drawer. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Never start the game. But if you do, never stop." It began on an ordinary Friday night, the campus quiet except for the occasional distant laughter of students heading to parties. Andrew, John's tech-savvy roommate, leaned against his desk, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Ever heard of the Black Gate?" Andrew asked, his voice low, conspiratorial. John sighed, rolling his eyes. "Let me guess, another one of your creepy internet games?" Andrew smirked. "Not just any game. This one's on the dark web. Supposedly it was designed by an ancient cult. You solve puzzles, unlock levels, and weird stuff starts happening." "Weird? Like what?" Andrew leaned closer. "People say the game reacts to you. It knows who you are, and if you quit before finishing..." He trailed off, letting the silence do the work. John laughed nervously. "And you want us to play it? Just for fun, huh?" Andrew shrugged. "Come on, you've been whining about how boring this place is." John hesitated but finally nodded. "All right, but if I start seeing ghosts or some crap, I'm blaming you." Andrew's laptop glowed ominously as the dark web interface loaded. The screen displayed a plain black background with the title, "The Black Gate," and a single line of text, "Oxoboan, dare to cross the threshold." Andrew clicked yes. The screen dissolved into static before resolving into a pixelated, cryptic interface. "Welcome to the Black Gate. Prove your worth." The first puzzle was simple, an arrangement of symbols resembling ancient runes. Andrew solved it in minutes, the screen shifting to the next challenge. But John felt the atmosphere in the room grow heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on him. The second puzzle was harder, a riddle about fire and sacrifice. Andrew solved it after some trial and error. "That's it?" John asked, leaning back. "I thought this was supposed to be scary." Andrew grinned. "We're just getting started." By the fifth level, things changed. The game's text began addressing them directly and expanding almost to a pandemonium of second orders, leading players to, "John and Andrew, your journey has only begun." John froze. "How does it know our names?" Andrew's grin faltered. "It's probably pulling info from the webcam or something." The next level appeared, accompanied by a live webcam feed of their dorm room. John's unease grew as he noticed something odd about the feed. "Andrew, look at the corner of the screen." In the live feed, a dark, humanoid figure stood in the corner of their dorm, motionless. But when they turned to look, the corner was empty. "Okay, that's creepy," John muttered. Andrew laughed nervously. "It's probably just a glitch, but glitches don't whisper." That night, as Andrew continued playing, John swore he heard faint whispers, like voices layered on top of each other, emanating from the laptop. The seventh level introduced a chilling instruction. "Offer something you hold dear." "What does that mean?" John asked, his voice tight. Andrew shrugged and placed a pen on the desk in front of the webcam. The game accepted it, the screen flashing. "Accepted. Proceed." But when they turned back to the desk, the pen was gone. Andrew dismissed it as a trick of the mind, but John felt his chest tighten. "I don't like this. We should stop." Andrew shook his head. "We're in too deep. You read the warnings. If we stop now, we're screwed." The puzzles became more invasive. The game asked for personal secrets, childhood memories, and fears. Each time they complied, the dorm grew colder, the shadows longer. By the 10th level, the game displayed a live feed of John's childhood home. "Andrew," John whispered, "how is it doing that?" The screen showed his old bedroom, eerily still, as though waiting for something to happen. The text on the screen read, "Confess your sins." Andrew hesitated. What sins? Suddenly, the lights in the dorm flickered, and the live feed panned to show a figure standing at the foot of John's childhood bed, a shadow with glowing red eyes. John stumbled back, his voice shaking. "This isn't a game anymore." The final levels were chaos. The laptop screen glitched, displaying distorted images of Andrew's family, John's home, and unfamiliar, grotesque faces. Andrew grew pale, his hands trembling as he typed. "It's almost over. Just one more level." The last instruction appeared. "Sacrifice what you love most." Andrew froze, his eyes wide. John grabbed his arm. "Don't do it." But Andrew's gaze was distant, his voice hollow. "It's the only way out." He typed something into the game, hit enter, and the screen went black. When the lights came back on, Andrew was gone. His desk, his belongings, everything remained. But there was no trace of him. John searched the dorm, his calls echoing into silence. On the laptop screen, a single line of text appeared. "The debt is paid. For now." Weeks later, strange things began happening to John. Doors in his dorm slammed shut on their own. He woke up to find scratches on the walls, and at night he swore he could hear Andrew's voice whispering from the dark corners of the room. One night, unable to sleep, he opened Andrew's laptop. The game had restarted, its text inviting him once again. "Dare to cross the threshold?" John stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The cursor hovered over the word yes. Did John give in and play the game? Would the game claim him as it did Andrew? Or was the game's curse something far worse? Something that would spread to anyone who dared to get close? The dorm room smelled of dust and mildew, as if no one had lived there for years. Brandon dragged his suitcase over the creaking floorboards, frowning at the barren walls and the single narrow window. The place wasn't much, but it was cheap, and it was his only option after his first housing application fell through. The landlord, a gruff older man with a permanent scowl, handed Brandon the key without so much as a smile. "Room's been empty a while," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "How long?" Brandon asked. But the landlord just shrugged. That should have been his first warning. Brandon spent the first week settling in. Classes had started, and he was too busy juggling syllabi and campus life to worry about the strange, drafty atmosphere of the room. At night, though, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he wasn't alone. The creaking started on his second night. It came from the bed opposite his, an old, sagging frame left behind by whoever had lived there last. Brandon tried to convince himself it was just the building settling, but he couldn't help glancing at the empty bed every few minutes, half expecting someone to be sitting there. A few days later, Brandon decided to clean under the bed. He dropped to his knees and lifted the dust-riddled blanket hanging over the edge. That's when he found it. A small notebook, its cover cracked and faded, lay nestled in the shadows. He pulled it out and flipped it open, revealing pages filled with cramped, scrawled handwriting. At first it seemed ordinary, notes about classes, doodles, reminders. But as he skimmed further, the writing became frantic, the lines crooked and uneven. "It watches me at night. I hear it breathing. It knows my name." Brandon's hands trembled as he turned to the last page. The writing there was barely legible, smeared and hurried. "I didn't mean to let it in." And beneath it, Etched into the paper as though the writer had pressed down with all their strength were the words, "Do not look in the closet." Brandon's gaze flicked toward the closet at the far end of the room. It was a narrow, unassuming thing with chipped white paint and a brass handle. For the first time since moving in, he noticed the door wasn't fully closed. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap, and he swore he felt something watching him from the other side. His heart pounded in his chest. "It's just a stupid notebook," he muttered, standing up and forcing himself to approach the closet. The closer he got, the colder the air became. He gripped the handle, pausing as his breath came out in visible puffs. Slowly, he pulled the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty except for a few wire hangers and a faint smell of mildew. Brandon let out a shaky laugh and turned back toward his bed, only to freeze. The notebook was open again, lying on his pillow. He was sure he had closed it before tossing it on the desk. And now, scrawled across the previously blank inside cover, were the words, "You shouldn't have looked." The next day, Brandon went to the campus archives. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong with his new room. He found a dusty file labeled Dorm 42A and began leafing through its records. The folder listed a series of students who had lived there, their names, dates of stay, and reasons for leaving. Most were unremarkable. But then he found a gap. For the year 2003, there was only a single note. Resident record unavailable. Room closed indefinitely. Brandon's stomach churned. He searched further and finally came across a newspaper clipping from the same year. The headline sent a shiver down his spine. "Student vanishes from campus dormitory. Case still open." The article described a student named Ian Vance, an art major who disappeared without a trace. According to the report, Ian had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, isolating himself, claiming to hear voices, and obsessively painting disturbing imagery. Brandon recognized one of the paintings pictured in the article. He had seen it before, in his own dorm room. That night, Brandon couldn't sleep. The notebook was back under his bed, where he'd thrown it after returning from the archives. But he couldn't stop staring at the closet. He didn't know when it started, but at some point he heard it, breathing. It was faint, but steady, like someone standing just behind him. He refused to turn around, clenching his eyes shut and gripping the edge of his blanket. The breathing grew louder. Then the whisper came, "Brandon!" He whipped around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The closet door was open again. The next morning, Brandon decided he had to leave. He couldn't spend another night in that room. As he packed his things, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Faint markings on the wall behind the second bed. Curious, he pushed the bed aside, revealing a hidden section of wall covered in old, peeling wallpaper. On it were dozens of drawings, dark, twisted images scratched into the surface like desperate carvings. Faces with hollow eyes stared back at him. Shadowy figures loomed over beds. In the center of it all, written in large, jagged letters, were the words, "It never leave us." Brandon stumbled back, his breathing shallow. That's when he heard the creak of the floorboards behind him. He turned slowly, his stomach knotting. Ian Vance was standing in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes hollow, just like the carvings on the wall. His mouth curled into a crooked smile. "You found me," Ian whispered. Then the light bulb flickered and went out. Days later, the landlord was showing the dorm room to a new student. "Cheap and cozy," he said, his voice gruff as usual. The student peered inside, smiling. "I'll take it." The landlord nodded, handing over the key. "You'll love it. Just don't touch anything that isn't yours." As the student stepped inside, The closet door creaked open slightly, as though welcoming them. And beneath the second bed, the notebook waited. The dollhouse. The letter arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon. Emily was sorting through a week's worth of bills when the envelope caught her eye. It was thick, yellowed, and bore no return address. The handwriting was spidery and unfamiliar, but the postmark was from the small coastal town of Hollow Pines, where her grandmother had lived before her death years ago. Inside was a single page. To my dearest Emily, I leave you my most cherished possession. May it bring you closer to your roots. Grandmother. No explanation, no details, just a cryptic note. 2 days later, a delivery truck arrived with a large wooden crate. The driver shrugged when Emily asked where it had come from. Got it from a warehouse upstate. Just said to bring it to you. Inside the crate was a dollhouse. It was enormous, intricately detailed, and strangely pristine despite its age. The roof was painted deep red, the shutters a pale green. Every window had lace curtains, and the tiny furniture inside was perfect down to the last detail. But what struck Emily most was how familiar it looked. It was an exact replica of her grandmother's house. Emily spent hours examining the dollhouse, marveling at the craftsmanship. Every room mirrored her grandmother's house perfectly, down to the floral wallpaper in the dining room and the creaky staircase that led to the attic. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dollhouse began to feel different. The once charming details now seemed unsettling. The tiny chairs too neatly arranged, the little windows too dark, as though they were hiding something inside. Shrugging off the unease, Emily placed the dollhouse in her living room and went to bed. At 3 a.m., she woke to a faint creaking sound. Her heart raced as she lay in the darkness, listening. The sound came again, a low groan, like footsteps on old wood. She crept to the living room, clutching her phone for light. The dollhouse stood in the shadows, its tiny windows glinting faintly. Everything was still, except for the tiny front door. It was ajar. The next morning, Emily convinced herself it had been her imagination. Maybe she hadn't closed the dollhouse door all the way. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. One evening, she found the tiny dining room chairs tipped over. Another day, a lamp in the dollhouse's living room was moved to the opposite corner. At first, she thought it was her cat Daisy, but Daisy avoided the dollhouse, hissing whenever she got too close. Emily decided to test her theory. She meticulously arranged the furniture inside the dollhouse, taking pictures with her phone to document everything. That night, she was startled awake by a loud bang. She rushed to the living room and found the dollhouse's tiny front door wide open. The furniture inside had been rearranged again. The dining table was pushed against the wall, and one of the miniature chairs was lying on its side. But what froze Emily in place was the attic window. The tiny curtains had been drawn back, and a shadowy figure stood inside. Desperate for answers, Emily called her mother the next day. "Did Grandma ever mention a dollhouse?" Emily asked. Her mother hesitated. "I haven't thought about that thing in years. She was obsessed with it, said it was her family's legacy. She'd sit for hours, arranging the furniture, talking to it like it was alive. What happened to it?" Her mother sighed. "After she died, it disappeared. We thought someone took it during the estate sale. Honestly, good riddance. That thing gave me the creeps." Emily's hands trembled as she hung up. She felt like the dollhouse had been waiting for her, biding its time. That night, Emily noticed something she hadn't before. A slip of paper was tucked inside the dollhouse's roof, its edges yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note. "The house remembers. The house reflects. Do not move what it does not wish moved." Do not look into the attic. Do not ignore the knock. As she read the last line, there was a sharp knock at her front door. Her blood ran cold. Emily froze, her eyes darting between the note and the dollhouse. The knock came again, louder this time, reverberating through the quiet room. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty, the street silent. When she turned back to the dollhouse, her heart nearly stopped. The tiny attic window was glowing faintly, a pale yellow light spilling through the curtains. Against every instinct, Emily grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the dollhouse attic. The light caught something. Movement. A tiny figure no taller than her thumb darted out of view. The next few nights were a blur of terror. The dollhouse began rearranging itself more violently. Furniture thrown across rooms, doors slammed shut. Emily tried locking the dollhouse in the closet, but the sounds didn't stop. Every night she heard faint footsteps, whispers that seemed to echo from within the walls, and the relentless knocking at her door. Then the dreams started. She dreamed of her grandmother's house, wandering its dark, empty halls. In the dream, the walls seemed to pulse, alive with a sinister energy. The attic door was always open, a shadowy figure waiting at the top of the stairs. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She decided to burn the dollhouse. She carried it into the backyard, dousing it with lighter fluid. Her hands shook as she struck the match, watching the flames lick the edges of the tiny house. But instead of burning, the dollhouse seemed to resist. The flames flickered and died, leaving the wood untouched. Suddenly, Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. When she turned back, the dollhouse was whole again, sitting perfectly in its crate, as though it had never been touched. That night, the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until Emily couldn't ignore it anymore. She opened the door to find nothing but darkness. When she turned back to the dollhouse, the front door was open, the tiny rooms filled with flickering candlelight. The attic window glowed brighter than ever, and Emily felt a pull, a compulsion to look inside. She leaned in, her face inches from the tiny attic, and she saw them. Dozens of tiny figures, their hollow eyes staring back at her. At their center stood a figure she recognized, her grandmother, smiling faintly. Before Emily could scream, the attic door swung shut. When Emily's friends came to check on her the next day, she was gone. The dollhouse stood in the living room, its miniature front door closed. Inside, the tiny furniture was perfectly arranged, and the attic window was dark. But if you looked closely, you could see a new figure standing in the parlor. A woman with long hair, clutching a tiny piece of paper. And if you listened carefully at night, you might hear her faintly knocking, begging to be let out. The sound in the walls. When Daniel's mother passed away, he inherited the house he had grown up in. It was a modest, two-story home nestled at the edge of a dense forest, its white paint chipped and its windows clouded with years of grime. The house had been empty for a decade, left untouched after Daniel's family moved away when he was a teenager. Now, as Daniel unlocked the creaking front door and stepped inside, memories came flooding back. The faint smell of wood polish and dust hung in the air, mingling with something else, something faintly metallic and damp. The house was just as he remembered it, but there was one thing he'd hoped to forget: the sound. As a child, he used to hear faint scratching and tapping inside the walls late at night. His parents told him it was mice, but the sounds always seemed too deliberate, too calculated. It wasn't just scratching. It was crawling, shifting, as though something larger than a mouse was moving through the house. He hadn't heard it in years, but as he stood in the empty living room, the silence stretched unnaturally. as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then, faintly, he heard it again. Daniel didn't sleep well. The bed he dragged from the guest room was lumpy, and the air in the house was uncomfortably cold. But it wasn't just the discomfort that kept him awake. It was the sound. At first it was a faint tapping, coming from the far corner of the room. It stopped when Daniel turned on the light, but as soon as he lay back down, it began again. Tap. Scratch. Tap, tap. He sat up, his heart pounding. "It's just the house settling," he muttered, but his voice sounded hollow in the empty room. The sound grew louder, moving closer. It seemed to travel through the walls, shifting from one side of the room to the other. Daniel pressed his ear to the plaster, his breath shallow. For a moment he thought he heard something beneath the scratching, a faint, wheezing breath. He pulled back quickly, his pulse racing. That night he dreamed of the house's basement, its walls damp and crumbling. In the dream, the scratching was louder, echoing from every corner. Something was waiting in the dark, just out of sight. The next morning, Daniel decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he pried open a section of the living room wall where the scratching had been loudest. Behind the plaster, he found nothing but empty space and old insulation. He exhaled a shaky laugh, feeling a little foolish. But as he turned to leave, his flashlight caught something, a faint smear on the insulation, dark and wet. Blood. Daniel stumbled back, his hands shaking. He wanted to convince himself it was rust or maybe water damage, but the smell was unmistakable. He sealed the wall back up and spent the rest of the day trying to distract himself. But by nightfall, the sound returned. Over the next few days, the scratching grew louder. It seemed to follow him from room to room, growing more insistent every night. He tried everything, setting traps, playing loud music, even calling an exterminator. But the traps were always empty, and the exterminator found no signs of rodents. One night, as Daniel lay awake listening to the relentless noise, the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. He sat up, his skin crawling. The air felt heavier, colder, and for a moment he thought he heard faint whispering, too low to make out. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a single, deliberate knock, coming from inside the wall near his bed. Daniel stared at the spot, frozen. "Who's there?" he whispered. The knock came again, louder this time. Desperate for answers, Daniel decided to explore the basement. It was the one part of the house he hadn't touched since moving back, partly because he hated how dark and damp it was. The basement was just as he remembered, its concrete floor cracked and uneven, the walls lined with old shelves and forgotten boxes. But something felt different. In the far corner, the wall seemed off. The bricks didn't match the rest of the basement, and the mortar looked newer, as though someone had sealed it recently. Daniel ran his hand over the bricks, his stomach tightening. He grabbed a hammer and chisel from his toolbox and began prying them loose. The first brick came free easily, revealing a dark, narrow gap behind the wall. As he worked, a foul smell wafted out, a mix of rot and damp earth. He gagged but kept going, driven by a growing sense of dread. When the hole was wide enough, he shone his flashlight inside. At first he saw nothing but dirt and rubble. Then his light caught something pale. A hand. Daniel stumbled back, his breath coming in gasps. The hand was skeletal, its fingers curled inward like claws. For a moment he considered calling the police, but something stopped him. A faint noise coming from inside the hidden space. It was the scratching. His heart pounding, Daniel leaned closer to the hole, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was inside was trying to claw its way out. Then, the whispering began. It was faint, almost inaudible, but Daniel could swear he heard his name. Daniel. He dropped the flashlight and stumbled back. The beam of light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the basement walls. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the hole, its body impossibly thin and covered in tattered, rotting fabric. Its face was a hollow void, and its bony fingers scraped against the concrete as it crawled toward him. Daniel screamed, scrambling up the stairs. He spent the next day trying to convince himself it was a hallucination, the product of sleep deprivation and stress, but deep down, he knew the truth. The house wasn't just old, it was hungry. That night, the sounds in the walls grew louder. The scratching was constant now, accompanied by faint laughter and muffled cries. Daniel locked himself in the bedroom, barricading the door with furniture. But as he lay in bed, clutching a baseball bat, the wall behind him began to bulge. The plaster cracked, and a skeletal hand burst through, its fingers grasping blindly. Daniel screamed, grabbing his bat and swinging wildly. The hand retreated, but the bulge in the wall grew larger, the whispers turning into guttural growls. The last thing Daniel saw before the wall collapsed entirely was the figure's hollow face staring down at him. When Daniel's cousin came to check on him the following week, the house was eerily quiet. The front door was unlocked and Daniel's belongings were scattered haphazardly throughout the rooms, but there was no sign of him. The cousin noticed a faint scratching sound coming from the walls, but dismissed it as mice. As she walked through the house, she didn't notice the faint shadow that flitted across the corner of the living room. And in the basement, the hole Daniel had opened was sealed once again, the bricks pristine. But late at night, the house exhaled a long, low creak, as though it was breathing, and the scratching began anew. Whispers in the fog. The fog was suffocating, dense enough to block out the sun. It coiled around the playground, muffling the laughter of children and the chatter of parents. Emma's hands trembled as she scanned the gray abyss, her voice cracking as she called, "Lila, where are you?" Her daughter had been playing by the swings moments ago. Now the small patch of grass was empty, the swing's chain swaying gently in the fog. A faint giggle echoed in the distance. "Lila?" Emma's voice rose in panic. She stumbled forward, her heart pounding. The giggle came again, soft and melodic, pulling her deeper into the mist. And then she saw it, a tiny shadow darting between the trees. Emma broke into a run, the fog swallowing her whole. "Lila, stop playing. This isn't funny." The laughter grew louder, but it wasn't Lila's anymore. It was deeper, distorted, as if the fog itself was mocking her. A shadow emerged ahead. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't her daughter. The figure was tall and spindly, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by the swirling mist. It tilted its head toward her, and from somewhere deep within, a chorus of voices whispered, "Come closer." Emma screamed, but the fog devoured the sound. Mira's car rolled to a stop at the edge of Ashen Creek, the tires crunching on gravel. The town was barely visible through the thick gray fog that clung to the earth like a living thing. She killed the engine and stared out the windshield. The letter from the lawyer rested on the passenger seat, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the crumpled fast food wrappers around it. To Mira Lockwood, as the sole surviving heir, you have inherited the property of your grandmother, Margaret Lockwood, located at 12 Hollow Pine Lane, Ashen Creek. Mira frowned. She hadn't even known her grandmother. Her mother had cut ties with the family years ago, refusing to speak about Ashen Creek or the people who lived there. Now, with her mother gone and no one else left, Mira had decided to claim the inheritance. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog pressed against her skin like damp cloth. The town loomed ahead, its buildings ghostly silhouettes in the mist. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Mira shivered. Something about the fog felt wrong. The house was exactly as the lawyer had described. Old, weathered, and untouched for decades. Its windows were smudged with grime, and ivy crept up the walls like veins. Mira pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she explored the small, dimly lit rooms. In the living room, she found a collection of dusty photographs on the mantel. One of them caught her eye. A black and white portrait of an elderly woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. Her grandmother. Mira stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the woman in the picture with the ghostly whispers of family stories. A faint sound broke the silence. A soft, rhythmic tapping. She turned toward the window. The fog outside seemed to press against the glass, swirling in hypnotic patterns. Tap, tap. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Mira's pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the window. A face appeared in the fog. It was pale and distorted, its features stretched unnaturally. Black, hollow eyes stared back at her. Mira stumbled back with a gasp, but when she looked again, the face was gone. The next morning, Mira ventured into town. Ashen Creek was eerily quiet. Most of the shops were boarded up, their signs faded and their windows cracked. A handful of people moved through the streets, their faces pale and drawn. At the diner, Mira ordered a coffee and sat by the window. The fog outside seemed thicker than ever, swallowing the light and muffling the world. An elderly waitress approached her table, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the cup. "You're Margaret's granddaughter, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice raspy. Mira nodded. "You knew her?" The waitress hesitated. "I knew of her. Your grandmother was different. She used to say the fog spoke to her." Mira frowned. "What do you mean?" She said it wasn't just weather. Said it was alive. The waitress glanced nervously toward the window, her voice dropping to a whisper. "People used to laugh at her, but now they're starting to believe her." Mira leaned closer. "Believe what?" The woman hesitated, her gaze darting around the diner as though someone might be listening. "That the fog takes people," she said finally. That night, Mira sat in her grandmother's living room, staring at the photo on the mantel. The house felt colder than before, and the fog outside was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. She thought about the waitress's words, about the stories she'd heard growing up, people disappearing into the mist, never to return. As the clock struck midnight, the whispers began. "Mira." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint, almost melodic, but it sent shivers down her spine. "Mira, come outside." She stood, her legs trembling, and moved to the window. The fog swirled violently, and faint shapes moved within it, dark silhouettes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that rose and fell like a sinister melody. "Mira, we're waiting." The next day, Mira decided to explore the forest that bordered the town. She followed a narrow path that wound between ancient trees, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The fog was thicker here, the air damp and heavy. As she ventured deeper, she began to notice strange markings on the trees, symbols carved into the bark, their shapes jagged and unfamiliar. The whispers followed her, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with every step. "Mira, this way." She stumbled into a clearing, and froze. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk blackened and twisted. The fog swirled around its base, and the ground beneath it was littered with bones. A figure emerged from the mist, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too wide. "Mira," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "We've been waiting for you." The man stepped closer, his movements unnaturally fluid. The fog seemed to ripple around him, alive and responsive. "What do you want?" Mira demanded, her voice shaking. The man tilted his head. "You inherited the house. You inherited the debt." "What debt?" He grinned, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Your grandmother made a deal. She promised us a soul, and now it's your turn." Mira's blood ran cold. "No," she said, taking a step back. "I don't believe you." The man's grin widened. "The fog doesn't care what you believe." That night, the fog consumed the town. It crept into houses, slithered through windows and pressed against doors. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their haunting melody. Mira sat in the living room, clutching a flashlight and a knife. The photo of her grandmother seemed to mock her, the woman's eyes cold and knowing. The whispers turned into screams. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. And then the door burst open and the fog poured in. When the townsfolk searched the house the next morning, they found it empty. Mira was gone, and the photo on the mantel was shattered. The fog was thinner that day, but as it swirled around the town, a new voice joined the whispers. A faint, desperate plea. "Help me." And the fog replied, "You belong to us."